Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeform, a world that just might work. I'll be speaking today with Tim Jackson about his new book, The Care Economy, and you can learn more at Tim Jackson, just like it sounds, one word, timjackson.org.uk. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on tunein.com, and podcasts are available anytime, anywhere at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY, all one word, .net. In my introduction of my previous conversation with Tim Jackson, which was in late 2021 on his previous book, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, and you can find it wherever you get your podcast, I asked the question, how do we replace the current destructive model of not just commerce, but I think almost reality, with a new one that's more effective at fulfilling human and planetary needs? And how do we do it in time? And I noted in that introduction, and I'm just going to repeat it here because it pertains, I've been asking that question for a long time. I did a documentary in 1973 on a Buckminster Fuller World Game Workshop, and the object of that game was, how can the needs of all be met within the limits of what Fuller termed Spaceship Earth? On this show, over the years, I've talked with too many individuals of both insight and experience to name all of them, but dealing with that question, they include Herman Daly, Raj Patel, Jeremy Rifkin, Jared Diamond, Richard Heinberg, Hazel Henderson, Gil Friend, David Korten, Ted Halstead, and Jonathan Rowe, both of whom passed away too early. Rob Johnson of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, Donella Meadows, one of the authors of Limits to Growth in 1972. As I said, that's just to name a few. Okay, so we've been banging at this door for a long time. In November 2024, I made my first invitation to Tim to join me to talk about this new book, and that was after the election, but it was long before the 100+ days of Trump 2.0. I knew I wanted to connect with him again as he developed his post-growth perspective, especially a vision of what comes next. The book came out in the UK early this year. It'll be published in the US May 27th, and we're recording this conversation May 15th. When we actually set up the timing a couple of weeks ago, I must confess I had second thoughts. I found this voice on my shoulder saying, what could be further from our current reality in the US than a care economy? Would talking about it seem naive or unserious as the multiple daily emergencies and outrages of Trump 2.0 explode around us? Maybe. But I realized there are plenty of sources of immediate reporting and responding. And I certainly hope that more and more will realize that Trump is not the solution and that the growing resistance is able to actually influence his actions. But we also need to offer people an alternative. Some of that will come down to personalities and candidates. We need winning communicators. Biden's inability to communicate his good policies and achievements damned not only the Democrats' 2024 election chances, but wrongly, I believe, has likely discredited the good policies. His was the first administration to reject neoliberalism and actually begin to act to make lives better for many of the very people least likely to vote for him. Last week, Robert Reich published an essay he titled, Keep Demonstrating Against Trump, but Also for a Better Future, The Importance of Progressive Populism. In it, he writes, we need to demonstrate not just against Trump, but also for the America we want. Trump's regressive populism, cruel, tyrannical, bigoted, authoritarian, must be met by a bold, progressive populism that strengthens democracy and shares the wealth. We can't simply return to the path we were on before Trump. That's the end of the Reich quote. I believe we need to offer a winning promise of a better life. Soon after the 2016 election, I discovered this quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, most famous for writing The Little Prince. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. How do we do that? How do we generate a vision of a future that is as welcome, compelling, inviting, and real as the past that some see so fondly to remember? Today's conversation with Tim Jackson is part of my attempt to imagine and flesh out such a vision. Tim Jackson is director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, CUSP, and professor of sustainable development at the University of Surrey in the UK. Over 3 decades, he's focused on the moral, economic, and social dimensions of prosperity on a finite planet. His books include Prosperity Without Growth, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, and his latest, as I said, The Care Economy. Tim is also an award-winning dramatist with numerous radio writing credits for the BBC. Welcome again, Tim Jackson, to Freeform, a world that just might work.
Thank you, Terence. It's great to be back here with you.
Very good. And I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and ideas we talk about. So I always ask folks to tell us a bit about their path. And they can go back, childhood inspirations, early turning points, mentors, that sort of thing. In your case, you can even weave in a bit of what we were talking about off air before we started, which is there's the playwright Tim Jackson, there's that creative artist Tim Jackson, there's the economist Tim Jackson, and in this book they seem to come together more than before. I hand it to you.
Yeah, I think they somehow did. Interestingly, my career as a playwright predates my career as an academic. I left university swearing never to go back, in fact. And that was in part because at that point I had already sold a play to the BBC. And so I moved to London thinking my career was going to be as a playwright. And then I remember this day very distinctly when I got the check for that very first play. And I think it was £400 or something. And I realized I was going to need to write plays very, very fast and sell them very, very fast to have a living. And so I ended up actually in London doing, all the jobs that you do before you have a career, waiting on tables, cleaning, building, mending roofs, whatever I could find really. And then in April 1986, Chernobyl melted down. And that to me was a landmark moment. It was a moment when I realized that our technological ability had this profound impact and a dangerous impact on our planet. And I felt as though I shouldn't be wasting my life waiting on, not to say that waiting on tables is a waste of one's life, but wasting the things that I had trained for, which I trained in university with mathematics and philosophy and a little bit of physics, and that I should be somehow responding to this call to arms, as I felt it was almost. And so I walked into the offices of Greenpeace, actually, and I said, look, I'm a guy with, this qualification and that qualification. I have no idea if you can use me, but I'm here if you can, and I'll do it for free if you want me to. And they put me to work straight away on looking at the economics of renewable energy. And from that moment, I sort of became, I like to think of it as an accidental economist. And I very quickly, as an economist, began to learn that it's not just about technology, it's about the economic system itself. And I began to see actually how increasingly what drives those dangerous environmental impacts that I was seeing in the world around me was this model of endless economic expansion. And that began to be the core of my work. In a certain point, I was appointed as the Economics Commissioner on the UK's Sustainable Development Commission, which reported directly to the UK government. And the culmination of that work was the book, Prosperity Without Growth. And it was a kind of a sensation in its own small way, not specifically because I had written something wonderful, although I do like to think it was a good book, but because it was written by an advisor to a government. And it was unusual, to say the least, for any government source to be critiquing the idea of economic growth. You mentioned in your introduction, you mentioned Herman Daly, for example, who you spoke to, unfortunately also passed away recently.
Right. I talked to him in 1999.
Fantastic. I think that was, did I meet him in 1999? I think I met him just a couple of years before that. And
Right.
he was a really important influence on me, probably 4 or 5 years before that. And his critique of growth, his steady state economy, his ideas about uneconomic growth, his index of sustainable economic well-being, which I then replicate in other countries, was strong to me. And it the direction of my work from that time onward into a kind of critique of our economic model. In a slightly provocative subtitle, Life After Capitalism. It was still along that same journey, if you like, along that same track, that exploration of the underlying structure of our economy and how it drives us towards environmental destruction on the one hand, to social inequality on the other hand, and even sometimes to financial instability. It seemed to me at the time that we were kind of reaching the ends of that model. And of course, I didn't at that time foresee that there would be another Trump administration and that we could actually go further down that same dark pathway towards chaos.
And oh,
But
by the way, I
it does
don't know
seem
that
to
you
me
mentioned the date. So the date for, just to peg a timeline there, the date for prosperity without growth.
the date for Prosperity Without Growth was 2009,
Okay.
and then as I think you mentioned, post growth was
Right.
2021.
Okay.
And so this decade and a half that's been now since Prosperity Without Growth was published has been, for me, quite extraordinary in the sense the reach that Prosperity Without Growth had throughout the world, I would have to say, not just the Western world. I mean, I had invitations to China. It's been published in Russian and Korean. It was even translated into Farsi by some academics who just liked the ideas that were at the core of that book and felt that they were relevant even in a country like Iran. And so it was one of those books that took me places I had never imagined when I wrote it as a government advisor that it would take me. The only people who really found it very, very difficult to listen to was the government for whom it was written. So
Right. There was
that was
pushback
a
right at
lesson.
that time, right?
It was quite a pushback. It was probably the fiercest pushback I've had in my career, and it remains with me as a lesson, really. I think the principal lesson was you don't always get what you want. You can think you've written the perfect policy document with all the prescriptions that the policymakers can pick up and run with next week if they want to, and they can still refuse to listen to a word of it. And so actually it began to make me feel, and this goes to some extent to this question of the playwright in me, it made me feel that perhaps there is a real advantage if you're trying to create change in not just having a direct route to government and putting a rational, well-argued document in their place, but actually building a groundswell, building a sense of a different kind of world that is accessible to ordinary people. And that's really very much what I wanted to do with the care economy. It's written in a very different way than Prosperity Without Growth was written.
Yeah, it certainly is. As I said, we spoke about this just a bit, that I could see, maybe it might have even been gradual for you, as in that thing of, I'm writing for my fellow economist academics. I'm writing for a government, um, you know, uh, administrative body. No, no. Now I'm writing for everybody. And one other thing I noticed in the book, Tim, is that, and I don't recall whether it was in the other, but I doubt it. Um, uh, you share with us actually a lot about your process. Like I thought I was going to write this, and then this
Yeah.
happened, and I ran into this, and then this came up in my life, and I'm traveling here. And that I'm guessing was at least liberating, although it may have even felt inevitable.
Maybe I can just sort of speak to that a little because it's really interesting and it goes to the point that you made right at the beginning, which is what on earth can we say about the care economy when we are hurtling towards violence, disintegration, political imperialism, almost totalitarian world? What is the point of talking about care?
And let me just say, by the way, I've been demonstrating, I've been holding signs, right? And one of my signs is stop the cruel, careless, costly chaos. It's interesting that one of those words is careless.
Yeah. And in the book, as when I got over that thing, what's the point of me writing about this? One of the ways that I got over it was actually to bring it to the surface, to bring that point to the surface. Care is this lovely, fluffy, rose-tinted word that appeals to our better nature. And actually, we're rushing into war wherever we can. We're funding military regimes. We're creating imperial ambitions. We're undermining the rules-based order for what it was worth. We're not. We have no shame really in the sense of direction we're going, and it's got nothing to do with care. So I was really struggling with it until I began to see that actually as you say, there is a kind of careless economy. And this economy is careless with our lives, with our health, with our security, with our diplomatic relationships. It's careless wherever you look. It's careless in our food industry. It's careless in our health industry. It's careless with the way it treats ordinary human beings. It's careless with those who care for us. And that was the thing that made me, in a sense, realize that this was not the wrong time to be talking about care. It was actually precisely the right one. And it was kind of needed. And even if it wasn't needed by other people, I felt like I needed to write it. And I needed to point people, in a sense, to this same struggle that I had gone through um, as a way of leading us away from a kind of moral high ground position where we appeal to some altruistic nature that we wish everybody had, and in particular, we wish everybody else had, and actually thinking about what care is, what it means, and how it differs from what we're doing at the moment in the economy.
And what I'm also hearing in what you're saying, and kind of in this little exchange, is that a lot of times authors tell me, I knew this book. I knew when I finished my last book what the next book was going to be. I knew where it had to go. I had it laid out, and I have a feeling that this one was not like that, and that it was evolving as you dealt with reality.
Well, let me put it like this, Terence. There was a book that I had in my mind almost immediately after I finished
Ah,
Post Growth.
so you had that same experience, yes.
It was to be called The Care Economy, and I sat down to write it, and I could not write it. It was as simple as and as difficult as that. It was the book that I had in mind was a very simple book. It had two premises: that prosperity is more about health than about wealth, and that care, the economy, therefore, should be more about care than about growth. That was kind of it. And then I was going to flesh this out. I was going to point to how we learned this lesson in the pandemic, and we would, behave better now because we understood that health matters and that caregivers matter. And that was the point really when, well, actually, I think it was probably very precise in February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, and then we were in a very different world. The pandemic was gone. All the good wishes, the Build Back Better
That's right.
bill in the United States, for example, that was going to put trillions of dollars, and some of them were going to build a better care system, and some of them were going to invest in renewables. And even that good intention, actually, within a few months of the outbreak of that war in the Ukraine, they were kind of rolling back ambition, and
Yeah,
we
well,
were in a
one
different
thing you
world.
point out is that um, the question, and it always comes up when we're talking about care and provision of care and all of that, is how will we pay for it?
Mm.
And I think, as you point out, once Russia invades the Ukraine, there are disagreements, there are arguments, but the money starts flowing.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. And it was the same in Europe. Recently the European Commission set a target for the rearming of Europe, which was 800 billion euros over the space of the next 3 or 4 years. They've spent a fraction of that putting together a health program. I mean, literally less than 0.5% of that in the post-pandemic years, where much more had been promised. Less than 0.5% of that rearmament budget has been spent towards the Health for All program. And so, it's like a madness that we can conjure up sovereign money to invest in things which destroy life and property, destroy our diplomatic relations with people that have been our allies less than 60, 70 years ago, put us on the brink of disasters that we can barely contemplate because we're actually messing with nuclear powers. And yet, that money is almost impossible to find when it comes to looking after the health of ordinary people, or even looking after the people who look after the health of ordinary people. And that seemed to be such an enormous failing that was, I think, the reason why I kind of felt the book had to be written, but it had to be written in a slightly different way than I imagined.
And we'll get into the content soon, or more deeply into the content. But one question that I had written, and I'm going to ask it the way I wrote it, although we've begun to play with it already, was how would you describe the book to folks as you were working on it?
Mm.
What are you doing, Tim? Well, and then would you describe it any differently today?
Well, it's funny because it is still a book which is very simple in its premise. Prosperity is more about health than about wealth. And so the economy should be more about care than about growth. Very, very simple. But actually, in a sense, it's so blindingly obvious when you get to think about it. What matters to people? If you don't have your health, you don't have anything. And that's been said over and over again by philosophers and sages throughout the ages. And therefore, what on earth would the economy be doing other than caring in all its forms, caring for people, caring for communities, caring for buildings, caring for for the environment, caring for our world? And when you put it like that, it is so blindingly obvious that the real question of the book becomes this: why does the blindingly obvious not happen? What is it that's going wrong? Is it structural? Is it philosophical? Is it spiritual in some sense? Is there something that is leading us astray, leading us away from what seems to be blindingly obvious, that we should be caring for health, and that health is the thing that really determines our prosperity?
And I also was curious how you chose care. I have a friend and colleague who he says well-being, that if any policy or any politician or any business leader or anyone, if what they're advocating for is not promoting well-being, that's the whole ball game. Others would say health or the common good, I think, is what Herman Daly
Yeah,
said. How did
yeah.
you choose care? And one thing that occurred to me is that one reason is that it's both a noun and a verb.
Yeah, no, I think that is a part of it. But to me, it's also a process. So let me take your point first of all about well-being, because I think it's a really good point. And well-being, the well-being economy actually, and the people who've talked about the well-being economy, I'm quite close to. I'm an ambassador for the Well-being Economy Alliance, as it turns out.
Oh,
Here's the thing. In 1948, the World Health Organization, so part of the UN architecture, defines health. And they define it as a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease and infirmity. So they relate health to well-being. So for me, health represents this goal, if you like, this target, the thing that we're aiming for. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about why it's different thing to aim for than aiming for the accumulation of wealth or aiming for growth, because it has a very different dynamic. And so the reason for selecting care essentially is care is the thing that brings us towards health. It's the process. And so, as you say, it's a verb as well as a noun. It has a dynamic. So let me just briefly talk about that dynamic because it's very important to the book. What is health? How does it work? Actually, in almost all physiological health, what matters is a balance. So this was, put very clearly by Walter Cannon back in the 1930s, where he talked about the wisdom of the body. The body has its own balancing mechanisms, homeostasis, it's typically called in physiology. And everything in the body is brought back into balance. It's a process of constant attention to our heart rate, to our breathing rate, to our temperature, our body temperature, to our blood glucose level, to our dopamine levels. And the body is constantly trying to balance these things. So health is the balance. And it seemed to me, as I began to think about this, that the process of bringing things back into balance is the process of care. It's a restorative force. It's not just as we were talking about before, just a kind of rose-tinted altruistic idea of being good in some undefinable sense. In fact, its moral unassailability is problematic because as soon as something is morally unassailable, it becomes kind of analytically useless. Everyone can claim it. You can claim it, you can claim it when you're dropping bombs on people. I'm caring for our political friends. You can claim it when you put your kids in a sweet shop and let them eat sweets all day. I'm caring for my kids. You can claim it if you're a doctor and you prescribe opioids that you know will addict your patient. I'm caring for them because they don't like pain. But none of these things restore balance. None of them actually promote health. And here's the most extraordinary thing. By contrast to the growth-based economy, the problem with capitalism is precisely that it doesn't see where balance lies. And even if it could see where that balance lay, it wouldn't know how to stop when it got there because it was intent on accumulation and growth, more and more and more. But more is not what the body does when it looks for health. It is about enough. It's about balance. Sometimes it's a little bit more, sometimes it's a little bit less. But our health lies in really quite a narrow range around a precise balance. And so this model of the care economy provides us with something which is starkly different from the growth-based economy in its most fundamental dynamic. It's not about accumulation, it's about the restoration of balance. And that's
right.
the
So
process of care.
it's not even, and I'm going to say something stupid here. It's not even about more health. If you know what I mean. It's not accumulating more.
It's not an accumulative thing.
Because
that's
that
right.
balance thing is sort of defies the word more.
Yeah. If you wanted to keep the idea of more, of course, we could say we would want more healthy people, or we would want more people to be healthy.
Or a
But
more
more
healthy,
health.
have a more healthy diet or a more healthy lifestyle.
For sure.
But in fact, that more is a bit of a misnomer because what ultimately we want is that balance.
Yeah, it doesn't work like it does in capitalism. I mean, capitalism is a kind of Miss Piggy more. What's better? What is better than more? Nothing is better than more. It's a constant insatiability. if you
and
like.
there is no enough in capitalism.
No, it sort of is. You pick up an economics textbook, as I did when I was learning to be an economist, and almost the first thing that you read is human needs are insatiable, planetary resources are scarce, and so that's where economics is coming in. That's what it's doing. It's trying to balance insatiable needs against finite resources, um, and 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 it's that axiom of insatiability really that motivates a lot of the way that capitalism has progressed and that the economic system has progressed and our economic policies have progressed. In fact, even in something like you mentioned food and health, this is a part of the story in the book, and it's a stunning fact that more people now die from diseases of overconsumption, from the overconsumption of the wrong kinds of food, than die from undernutrition, from malnutrition, from diseases of malnutrition. And in fact, 74%, 75% of mortality is attributable to chronic disease, which itself is attributable to poor diet, poor nutrition, lifestyle, stress in our world, and environmental toxins. We've shifted in the last 50 years in particular from a world in which people were dying from not having enough to a world in which people are dying from having too much and too much of very specifically the wrong things. And yet we justify that industry which is promoting the selling of more and more of those wrong things in the name of economic growth. And that's where it begins to come home. That's where this distinction between care, the restoration of balance, the returning to health, it forces us to think differently about the economic system, which is doing the very opposite, which is pushing us continually out of balance and has done so successfully that 3/4 of deaths are now attributable to a sort of overconsumption rather than an underconsumption.
Yeah, I remember when I first read the statistic that there were more, and it's a variation on what you just said, but that there were more people suffering from obesity than from food insecurity. And um, in our lifetime, right? That's
Yeah,
definitely within our
yeah.
lifetime. Let me tell people, by the way, this is Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Tim Jackson about his new book, The Care Economy. And you can learn more at Tim Jackson, one word, timjackson.org.uk. So let me ask you this, because I'm sure you had to ask yourself, was there a point? And the reading that I've been doing lately on the newest work in archaeology and paleontology and those sorts of things there's new findings about what we were for most of our time on this planet, it seems. And my guess is that it was much more aligned with this vision. As I think economists have long said, it wasn't until agriculture that you could have surplus, and with surplus came exploitation and so many other things, urbanism, all of those sorts of things. But when you've looked at the evolution of how we got here, a couple of questions. Was there a time when accumulation and insatiability were not the rule? And how did care get shuttled off to the side and become almost, I think one of the things that's been running through my head is that this is one of those conversations about fish in water, right? In other words, much of what we've been saying in the first half hour is things that are readily apparent and yet not seen.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in that question, really
Yes,
two
there is. I
key
realize it's
questions,
like
I guess.
five
Yeah,
questions, but
I mean, so historically, yes, that is the general opinion, is that kind of agriculture allowed for surplus. Surplus began to create both expansion and also conflict and the extraction of value from the land. And as you say, that the kind of general opinion that kind of agriculture shifted things. It suddenly it produced surplus, and that surplus could be used to expand And that expansion began to create resource conflicts and violence and different kinds of society. This is quite a well-rehearsed thesis. It isn't entirely true to say that the care went away from that point. I think care has always been, and I think this is one of my main points in the book. Without care, you could not do any of that, because you need to care for small children, you need to care for women when they're pregnant, you need to care for people when they're sick, you ultimately need to care people when they're injured in battle, for example. This process of care is fundamental. It's the first thing in the economy, not the thing that is thought of as a kind of luxury that we can only afford if we've made a certain amount of growth before we get there. It's actually the thing without which there is no economy. So to that extent, it's always been there. But you're right to suggest that it kind of, it comes and goes. Sometimes it's there more strongly, sometimes it's more supported. Different kinds of societies integrate it more into the way that they organize their structure. And in our society, and in particular since capitalism itself, that concept has been harder and harder to maintain. And there was a specific point in the beginning of the 20th century, really through the rise of capitalism, in which our model of health shifted dramatically. And this actually happened in a very precise moment in time. In 1910, a man named Abraham Flexner was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation and later then by the Rockefeller Foundation to professionalize medicine, to come up with a way of making medicine a profession largely dominated actually by men, that was scientific, laboratory-based, and that had as its outcome a kind of pharmaceutical route towards health. So drugs are things that you can manufacture in laboratories, you can attack germs with them, and you can sell them. And that sale creates profit, and that profit begins to accumulate wealth. And so it's no surprise that it was people like Rockefeller and Carnegie who could see this. They could see markets, they could see that the rise of the pharmaceutical industry would actually be an earner for people like themselves and for the countries in which those people lived. But what it did to medicine essentially was to exile a view of medicine which is completely different, a view of medicine which is much more based around this idea of health as balance, a view of medicine which saw the healing power of the body itself, a process of care within the body that healed, and a process of care around the body that looked after the conditions that would then allow us to heal ourselves. And that care had been largely the domain before that Flexner report of women, of lay healers, and of people without these formal scientific qualifications. And suddenly, after the Flexner report, they became, and the whole idea of naturopathy, the whole idea of the healing power of nature became exiled, and it became designated as quacktale. Through the pandemic, post-pandemic, you find this argument going on. And the argument is essentially that forms of medicine, forms of health, forms of care, which don't accord to this pharmaceutical scientific model of medicine, are deemed as alternative, complementary, and often simply the result of quacks trying to make a quick killing by selling a cure that never works. And even very, very well-respected people become demonized when they suggest that actually, looking after your diet is a really good thing to do if you have a chronic disease. And in many ways, there are no pharmaceutical cures to chronic diseases. There's some pharmaceutical cures to infectious disease, but as with chronic disease is to treat symptoms. It's never a cure of the disease. And it's as far from the health of the body back into balance. And with any pharmaceutical, you're actually introducing a toxin in the body. And you're introducing the toxin into a body that evolved over millions of years to look after itself and to look after its own balances, and was never exposed to that toxin in the process.
Yeah, it's wild to think that something like a report could be that much of a pivot point in something as essential as how we relate to our own health and our own survival. But I
It
get,
isn't, it's not the only pivot points, I have to say. You know, it's very interesting when I began to look at the history of this, and I had not thought about it at all. And it was really a history that was exposed, I have to say, largely by women writers, by feminists writing, for example, back in the 1970s. There was a movement, Our Bodies, Ourselves, and this a movement towards, you know, women being able to reclaim looking after their own health from a medical system that had taken it away from them. And there were two women in particular, Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre England. They wrote this book, you know, back in the 1970s, which was called Nurses, Witches, and Midwives. Essentially, what it was saying, apart from that pharmaceutical turn at the beginning of the 20th century, was that the process of expelling care, expelling this naturalistic way of thinking about health, and in the process expelling women from medicine, was also what was going on during the witch hunts. So most of the witches who were burned at the stake or executed in some way were women. Most of them were lay healers. Most of them were very scientific, actually, in the way that they applied their cures, and they had developed them over generations. It was knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation. And they were essentially such a threat to a male-dominated church and a male-dominated medical system that they paid the ultimate price. And so,
wow, so
you know, you have,
even when the male-dominated system was quite primitive relative
yeah,
to this high-tech pharmaceutical surgical procedure life we
yes,
live, even then, those natural healers were a threat.
yes, and they were a threat in part because they chose a scientific method, this method of, you know, exploring the results of specific cures in specific ways in an empirical way, looking at whether it helped or not. And this was a direct threat to faith in the authority of the church in particular. And so, you know, at a time when people believed that if you were sick, it's because the devil was in you and you needed a priest to exorcise the devil and then you would be fine. There were people, you know, using herbal remedies, using traditional remedies, using naturopathy, essentially. And these people were a threat to that authority of the church. And so even in the Middle Ages, the medieval ages, this was a battle that was going on for the soul of medicine. And it was also a battle that was going on, as it happened, between male authority and female authority. And women were losing. And this is
Right.
really what Ehrenreich and English pointed out in the 1970s.
Before you even began this track of the thing, the word I had written down was gender.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, just as we began to look at the history, it seemed to me and you write a fair amount about that, both in terms of the history as you're telling it right now, but even the re-examination of the paradigm. When it comes time for your chapter in which you're saying, so what do we do?
Yes.
Right? You say, well, first thing we do is you look at people who have already answered that question, and you list about 20 books by women.
Yeah. I mean, it is extraordinary. Terence, I mean, it is one of the things that was difficult about writing the book for me.
Oh,
Um,
was the fact that you were a
because,
male?
yeah, I mean, and I knew that women, that feminist economists, that feminist sociologists, that women had written about care in the economy and had pointed to many of the things that I was thinking in terms of. And I'd read quite a lot of them, but what I hadn't really sort of figured out for myself until I started to write my thesis, prosperity is about health, economy should be more about care than growth. I hadn't figured out that actually I'm sitting down as a man to say something very similar in some ways to things that have been said by women. So what am I doing here? I felt like, and I describe this in the book, I felt like I'm a foreigner in the land of the invisible heart. And the invisible heart is a lovely description that Nancy Folber has for the fact that health and care are really the thing that keeps our economy going, and something she's pointed out in numerous ways on numerous occasions, as numerous other women have done. And I felt suddenly like I'd kind of wandered into the land of the invisible heart with my big white male economist boots, but without checking my footwear. What am I doing
And
here?
by the way, you didn't say it there, so I'm going to add it, which is that when you introduce her notion of the invisible heart, you say male economists love pointing to Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Yeah, exactly.
They
say
miss.
Exactly. So, and the invisible hand, if you remember, I mean, it's not a stupid concept. It's the idea that if you get the conditions right, then the market has a way of regulating social behavior so that you get good outcomes, good social outcomes by having free trade. And this is supposed to be, the selfishness of the traders themselves suddenly transforms into a socially optimal solution.
Right. On the micro, it's selfish. On the macro, it's good.
That's the logic of it. And in the kinds of markets that Adam Smith was looking at when he came up with the idea of the invisible hand, you can see some logic to it. Actually, in the kinds of markets that have developed since, it's lost its logic. But Nancy Folber's point is that there's a whole bunch of things that don't happen in that way in the market. And they are absolutely critical to our survival, to our health, to our ability to work, and even, therefore, to the market itself. Before the market comes care. Before the invisible hand comes the invisible heart. And it's such a solid, well-documented, well-articulated way of critiquing what's going on within capitalism that I did begin to feel that not that I didn't have anything to say, because I think there was a lot that by that stage that I'd done a lot of the research, I'd picked up some of this historical stuff. I was thinking through the arguments that mattered. The one that tripped me up the most, I think, was this point about gender, that I was there's a point, and I didn't say it in the book, I could sort of write the reviews before I'd started writing. White male economist mansplains care. Terrific, just what the doctor ordered. And it was tricky, it was tricky for me to get beyond that. And I kept asking myself throughout the process of writing the book, what have I got to say here? What, as a man, have I got to say? And then I also began to feel, and I must say that I have had really good support from female economists, female writers for my project in doing this. And I began to feel as though care could not just be something that lived with the opposite gender. It has to be a concept that men associate with, understand, acknowledge, and participate in, as well as women. And therefore there is and was and will be a need for men to be able to write about and think about care. And that in some sense, when you think of care in these terms as this restorative force, this restoration constantly back to a state of the balance of health, then it is beyond gender. It's not a gender. We perceive care as a huge gender division in our society, but actually it's a fundamental principle that runs through all humanity, men and women. And that chapter, for me, towards the end of the book, the one that's principally about gender, my journey towards that chapter was difficult, torrid, uncertain. But when I got to it, it was a sort of a release for me, because I had got to a point where I was able to face actually that my own gender was most culpable in neglecting care, most culpable in building an economics which expelled care, and most culpable in all the turns in history which penalized and punished women for being those who cared. And so, it's not as though I was writing the book as a kind of atonement for the sins of mankind.
Making amends.
But well, but it was for me, and I go back to the point that in a sense, I was writing the book at that point for myself. I wanted to know where I stood in relation to what had become a very gendered debate. And I wanted to know what it was that men and women should be thinking about in relation to the gendered nature of that debate. And so that chapter where I address that, I don't know whether your audience is too polite company to speak the words of the chapter title. I'll let you do that maybe, but it was that chapter title, and that idea of confronting the patriarchy, understanding that it was damaging both women and men, and that it was damaging society in itself. That became an incredibly important chapter in the book for me.
Right. You've got about 5 minutes. I have found this to be a very alive conversation versus a pre-digested one, if you follow me.
Yeah, definitely.
Just as we sort of talked about, the book became a very alive book rather than a fill in the blanks. But perhaps if I throw it to you and say, you've got about 5 minutes, what do you feel we haven't said that you want to make sure people get?
Well, in some ways, we've touched on a lot of things, so maybe we have said it a little bit, but it is apart from gender, one of the things that was very tricky for me, as I said at the beginning, was this sense of what's the point of talking about care when we're rushing towards violence. And one of the things that I began to feel, in fact, it was triggered by something I read in one of these wonderful women's books. Kathleen Lynch, in a book called Care and Capitalism, makes a very good point that you cannot hope to understand care unless you understand care's nemesis, which is violence. And so it's the tension between violence and care became an incredibly important theme for me. It became, in a way, the theme through which the book achieves its biggest impact, I think, in the world that we're living in the rush towards violence, in the instability at this point in time. It becomes the antidote to a philosophy that says the only way forwards is through violence and conflict. It becomes a different lens through which to look at the world. And you look at the food industry and our health through this different lens. You look at the relationships between nations through this different lens. You look at your own behavior through this lens. And you begin to realize, actually, that a part of what's happened in that gendered division of society, in which women are conditioned into care and men are conditioned out of care, is that in the process, men are conditioned into violence. And this violence comes from, in part at least, from the nation state's need for security in an insecure world. And the insecurity of that world is about its territorial ambitions, about its insatiability, about its need for resources. And this leads us into conflict. The conflict leads us into insecurity. The insecurity means that we have to have a defense budget. We have to have a rearmament of Europe and trillions of dollars to the sale of arms to all over the world. And this is the thing that is undermining the economy, undermining our health, undermining our well-being, and undermining our individual security. And so it becomes this division between care and violence, in which men are conditioned into this violent role because there's a need for it, so that we can keep out the other bad men, we can secure the nation state, we can secure the resources that we need, we can engage in all the conflicts we want, is a devastation, not just to women and the impact that it has on women, but to men as well. Because we're actually being conditioned into a place where we move away from our nature as human beings, and we become essentially vassals in the war machine for imperialistic nation states. And that is a horrible place to be. It's a careless economy in all the worst possible ways. And it's careless of men, it's careless of women, it's careless of children, it's careless of relations between countries, it's careless of health, it's careless of food. And care is the lens through which we see this and bring ourselves back into that balance.
Wow. Yeah. I would let that be the last word. I just want to throw out, we don't have time to go into, but just throw out some of the things that came up for me as you were speaking, which is an issue which is very big in the United States, but I believe is true certainly in Western Europe and the Middle East and probably globally, which is the problem with men and boys.
Right.
As women's role in life has improved, if you will, men have felt, they've lost out. It comes, I suppose, from that wonderful scarcity mentality, that everything's zero sum, and if somebody wins, somebody loses. But I found an article this morning that said there'd been a recent poll and more men wanted to be in caring professions, and that this finding had come true around the world. When I look at the work of Richard Reeves, who's wrote the book of Boys and Men, and what are the recommendations for what we could do? Well, one recommendation would be to give boys more models of men in caring professions. So it is just interesting how these different strands, like a problem that seems, what does that problem have to do with that they are all so interconnected, and that I would, in one sense, I would say we do live in a care economy. We just don't recognize it. And we don't recognize that we are in a huge deficit.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think care, as I was saying before, is the basis for everything. We could not live outside of it. We just simply would not survive. We wouldn't grow. We wouldn't flourish. We wouldn't have good relationships. We wouldn't build things. We wouldn't collaborate. None of that would be possible.
Life would not be worth living.
Life, I mean, this was one of the things that I came to at the end of the day. Life would not happen. To me, care is fundamentally the organizing principle for organic life. And that's why it should become the organizing principle for our economy.
We can leave it at that. So again, the book is The Care Economy. He's Tim Jackson. The website to learn more is timjackson.org.uk. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. If you want to get my weekly email announcement, it tells you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and links to probably 10 or 15 articles, timely, fleshing out the conversation, email me at TEMcNally, TEMCNALLY, at mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast at most of those major podcast sites where you can find it. And the archives, I've been doing this for a long time. The archives at places like Apple and Spotify and so on, I believe, go back hundreds. Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Bill McKibben, Connie Rice, George Packer, Doris Kearns Goodwin. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, Tim Jackson, and keep up your good work.
Thank you, Terrence. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely.